The most dangerous mistake a man can make is believing that the woman who walked away has nowhere else to go. By the time Ethan Brooks realized how wrong he had been, the wedding bells echoing through St. Patrick's Cathedral were no longer announcing the future he once imagined for himself. They were celebrating a future he could never touch. Morning sunlight streamed through the towering stained glass windows, scattering ribbons of gold and sapphire across polished marble floors as nearly 400 guests rose to their feet in quiet admiration. The string quartet softened into a familiar melody, but no one seemed to notice the music anymore. Every eye in the cathedral had shifted toward the woman standing at the end of the aisle. Naomi Carter stood perfectly still, her ivory gown elegant without trying to impress, its timeless design reflecting the quiet confidence she had earned rather than borrowed. She didn't smile immediately. Instead, she closed her eyes for the briefest moment, drawing a slow breath that seemed to carry years of heartbreak away with it. Across the aisle waited Alexander Whitmore, founder of Whitmore Holdings, a man whose name appeared on the covers of business magazines more often than Hollywood celebrities appeared on entertainment news. At 40, Alexander had built one of the largest commercial real estate companies in America without inheriting a fortune or chasing headlines. His tailored tuxedo and composed posture reflected the same quiet discipline that had made investors trust him with billions of dollars. Yet, at this moment, the billionaire wasn't watching the photographers gathered near the entrance. He wasn't acknowledging the governors, CEOs, judges, or philanthropists seated in the front rows. His entire attention rested on Naomi, as though every remarkable achievement in his life had merely led him to this single morning. Near the back of the cathedral, unnoticed by almost everyone, another man remained standing long after everyone else had taken their seats. Ethan Brooks felt the weight of the invitation trembling between his fingers. He had almost thrown it away 3 days earlier, convinced it was some elaborate publicity stunt. Naomi Carter marrying Alexander Whitmore? Impossible. Naomi had once shared a tiny apartment with him, celebrated birthdays with homemade dinners, and believed that love mattered more than status. She wasn't supposed to become part of a world protected by private security, chauffeured cars, and international headlines. More importantly, she wasn't supposed to stop needing him. Months earlier, when he ended their marriage with cold certainty, Ethan had rehearsed the next chapter in his mind countless times. She would call, she would cry, she would ask for another chance. Pride, he believed, never survived loneliness. But she never called. She never sent angry messages. She never defended herself. She simply disappeared from the story he thought he controlled. Now, watching the sunlight settle across her calm expression, Ethan noticed something he had never truly seen before. Naomi wasn't standing beside Alexander because she had been rescued. She was standing there because somewhere along the way, she had rescued herself. Then Alexander reached forward and gently took her hand, and in that quiet gesture, Ethan felt something inside him collapse. Not because another man had won, but because for the very first time, he understood that the greatest loss in his life had happened long before this wedding day. It had begun the moment he mistook unwavering dignity for weakness, and the truth behind that mistake was a story no one in the cathedral knew. 6 months earlier, the rain had washed the streets of Manhattan until every window reflected a city that looked colder than it truly was. Naomi Carter stood inside the apartment she had once called home, carefully folding the last of her clothes into a single navy suitcase that had survived 3 apartments, 2 promotions, and 1 marriage she had believed would last forever. Nothing in the room suggested a dramatic ending. The books remained neatly arranged on the shelves. The framed vacation photograph still rested above the fireplace. A mug Ethan had brought back from Boston sat untouched beside the coffee maker. Ordinary objects often became the quiet witnesses to extraordinary endings. Ethan Brooks adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt without looking at her. His overnight bag was already waiting near the front door, as though he had rehearsed this departure long before saying the words aloud. The silence between them was not filled with anger. It was filled with certainty, at least on his side. He believed the conversation had already ended before it had even begun. "You deserve someone who fits the life I am building," he said evenly, keeping his attention on the skyline beyond the living room window. "We both know we want different futures." Naomi looked at him for several seconds before answering. She had learned over the years that the loudest emotions rarely change the outcome of difficult conversations. "If that is what you believe," she replied softly, "then I will not stand in your way." Ethan finally turned toward her, almost surprised by how calmly the words had landed. He had expected questions. He had prepared explanations. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he had even imagined tears that would confirm he still mattered more than her pride. Instead, Naomi simply zipped the suitcase closed with slow, deliberate hands. That quiet sound unsettled him far more than any argument could have. "You are not going to say anything else?" he asked. Naomi offered a faint, almost tired smile. Sometimes people stop talking because they have already been unheard for a very long time. The sentence lingered in the apartment long after she finished speaking. Ethan forced a short laugh, convincing himself that silence was simply another stage of grief. She would call after spending a few nights alone. She would realize how expensive New York had become. She would remember the comfortable life they had built together. She would come back. He had reduced love to a negotiation, believing stability always outweighed dignity. Naomi walked toward the front door, pausing only long enough to remove her wedding ring. She placed it carefully on the hallway table beside the house keys. There was no dramatic gesture, no final speech, no demand that he regret his decision. She simply refused to carry a promise that no longer belonged to both of them. As she stepped into the hallway, the elevator doors opened with a quiet chime. The elderly doorman downstairs greeted her with the same warm smile he always offered every resident. "Moving somewhere nicer, Miss Carter?" he asked kindly while helping with the suitcase. Naomi glanced back at the building for only a second before answering. "I do not know where I am going yet," she said. "I only know I cannot stay where I am no longer valued." The taxi disappeared into the evening traffic, leaving Ethan standing behind the apartment window with complete confidence that she would soon return. What he never realized was that the woman driving away was not searching for another person to save her life. She was searching for the version of herself she had quietly abandoned while trying to save a marriage that only one heart had been fighting to protect. The first thing Naomi Carter noticed about her new apartment was the silence. Not the lonely kind that echoed through empty rooms, but the peaceful kind that allowed a person to hear their own thoughts again. The building overlooked the East River, several subway stops away from the neighborhood she had shared with Ethan Brooks. It was smaller than the apartment she had left behind, with narrow windows and worn hardwood floors that carried the character of decades instead of luxury. She unpacked only the essentials during her first evening: a reading lamp, her favorite coffee mug, 2 framed photographs of her late father. Everything else could wait. Reinvention rarely arrived all at once. It usually began with ordinary decisions repeated day after day. On Monday morning, Naomi walked into Harper & Ellis Design Studio 15 minutes early, just as she had every workday for the past 4 years. Only a handful of colleagues knew her marriage had ended. She preferred it that way. Sympathy often became another burden for people already learning how to stand again. By lunchtime, she had buried herself in architectural drawings for a nonprofit community center in Brooklyn, grateful that measurements and materials demanded more attention than memories ever could. Shortly after 3 o'clock, her creative director appeared beside her desk, carrying a leather portfolio. "Naomi, I need someone to present revised concepts tomorrow morning." The client moved the meeting to Whitmore Holdings. She looked up in surprise. Whitmore Holdings was one of the largest development companies in the country. Winning the account could change the future of the entire studio. "I thought Daniel was leading the presentation," she replied. "He came down with the flu," her director answered. "You know this project better than anyone else. I trust you." The following morning, Naomi stepped into the lobby of Whitmore Tower, where sunlight poured through 40-foot glass walls and reflected across polished limestone like liquid gold. The reception area felt impressive without being excessive. Everything suggested quiet confidence instead of unnecessary extravagance. While waiting for the elevator, she reviewed her notes one final time, determined to focus only on the presentation. The elevator doors opened onto the executive floor, where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Manhattan skyline stretching endlessly toward the horizon. As she entered the conference room, several executives were already seated around the long walnut table. At the far end sat Alexander Whitmore. His reputation had always reached people before he did. Newspapers described him as disciplined, demanding, and impossible to impress. Yet the man who stood to greet everyone carried none of the arrogance Naomi had expected. He thanked each presenter individually, remembered names without checking the attendance list, and invited junior staff to speak before senior executives interrupted them. During Naomi's presentation, Alexander remained unusually quiet. He listened without glancing at his phone or whispering to assistants. When she explained how natural light could transform shared community spaces into places that encouraged trust and connection, he asked thoughtful questions instead of challenging her conclusions. Nearly 90 minutes later, the meeting ended. As the other executives filtered toward the hallway, Alexander approached Naomi with a calm expression. "Miss Carter," he said, extending his hand. "Most people design buildings. You described how people might actually live inside them. That is much harder to do." Naomi thanked him politely, assuming the conversation had ended. Instead, he handed her a simple business card bearing only his name and direct office number. "If you ever decide you want your work to shape projects instead of presentations," he said, "I hope you will call." She slipped the card into her portfolio without giving it much thought. At that moment, it looked like nothing more than professional courtesy. Neither of them realized that a single business card, quietly exchanged beneath the Manhattan skyline, had just become the first page of a story that neither success nor regret would ever be able to rewrite. For the next 2 weeks, the business card remained tucked inside Naomi Carter's leather portfolio, untouched and almost forgotten beneath project sketches, client notes, and color samples. She was determined not to mistake professional kindness for personal opportunity. Her life had already taught her that assumptions often carried a higher price than disappointment itself. Every morning followed the same rhythm: coffee before sunrise, a subway ride into Midtown, long hours refining blueprints that would eventually become schools, libraries, and community spaces where strangers might someday become neighbors. There was comfort in routine because routine asked nothing except consistency. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, her office received unexpected news. Whitmore Holdings had approved the entire proposal without requesting a single design revision. Her creative director could barely contain his excitement. "Do you understand how rare this is?" he asked, setting the signed agreement on her desk. Alexander Whitmore almost always requests changes. He approved everything exactly as you presented it. Naomi smiled politely, believing the quality of the team's work deserved the credit. Before she could return to her drawings, the receptionist appeared with a small envelope addressed only to her. Inside rested a handwritten note on thick cream stationery. "Miss Carter, your presentation reminded me that successful buildings are measured by the lives they improve, not the headlines they generate. If your schedule allows, I would appreciate discussing several upcoming projects over dinner tomorrow evening. No obligations, no expectations. Simply a conversation between two people who believe good work deserves thoughtful discussion. Alexander Whitmore." Naomi read the note twice before quietly placing it back into the envelope. It was respectful, direct, and remarkably free from the polished charm she had grown accustomed to hearing from influential clients. After several minutes of reflection, she accepted the invitation. The following evening, a black sedan arrived precisely at 6:30 outside her apartment building. The driver greeted her by name before opening the rear door. Instead of a crowded luxury restaurant, the car stopped beside a restored brownstone overlooking the Hudson River. Inside, the dining room held only 6 tables, each separated by enough distance that conversations remained private without feeling secretive. Alexander stood as she approached, thanking her for coming, before pulling out her chair with quiet courtesy. Throughout dinner, he asked surprisingly little about her personal life. Instead, he wanted to know why she had chosen architecture instead of corporate design, why public libraries mattered to her, and why every one of her proposals included outdoor gathering spaces. Naomi answered honestly. She spoke about neighborhoods where children needed safe places to dream, about her father's belief that every community deserved beauty regardless of income, and about the responsibility that came with creating spaces people would remember long after architects were forgotten. Alexander listened more than he spoke, occasionally smiling when her passion transformed technical explanations into deeply human stories. As dessert arrived, his assistant quietly entered the room and placed a folder beside him before leaving again. Alexander slid the folder across the table. "This is not a job offer," he said calmly. "Not yet. It is an invitation." Naomi opened the folder to discover plans for a nationwide initiative to renovate aging community centers across dozens of American cities. The project would require years to complete and touch thousands of families. "Why are you showing this to me?" she asked. Alexander looked through the restaurant window toward the evening lights reflecting across the river before answering. "Because everyone else who reviewed these plans calculated the cost. You were the first person who talked about the people who would eventually walk through the front doors." Naomi lowered her eyes to the blueprints again, unaware that the opportunity resting before her represented far more than a career milestone. Somewhere across Manhattan, Ethan Brooks was still waiting for a telephone call that would never come, never imagining that while he remained convinced the past would return to him, Naomi's future had quietly begun unfolding one respectful conversation at a time. Naomi Carter spent the next several days studying every page inside the proposal Alexander Whitmore had entrusted to her. The numbers were impressive, but they were never the reason she accepted the invitation to continue the conversation. What held her attention were the photographs attached to each location. Aging recreation centers with leaking roofs, empty libraries waiting to welcome children again, parks where cracked sidewalks had slowly replaced laughter. She recognized something familiar in every image. They reminded her of neighborhoods where people did not ask for miracles. They simply hoped someone would remember they existed. On Monday morning, she arrived at Whitmore Holdings carrying a notebook filled with handwritten observations, rather than polished presentations. Alexander welcomed her into his office, overlooking Central Park, where the first colors of autumn had begun transforming the trees into shades of amber and crimson. The office reflected the same quiet discipline she had noticed during their first meeting. There were no unnecessary displays of wealth, only carefully organized books, architectural models, and family photographs resting beside framed engineering sketches. Most consultants begin by explaining why a project cannot be completed within budget, Alexander said with a faint smile, as they sat across from one another. "You brought a notebook instead." Naomi opened the worn leather cover and gently slid it across the desk. Every page contained ideas written in careful handwriting, accompanied by rough sketches showing how each building could become more welcoming without dramatically increasing construction costs. "People remember how a place makes them feel long before they remember how much it cost," she explained. Alexander studied the pages quietly. He asked questions, not to challenge her, but to understand the reasoning behind every suggestion. Nearly 3 hours passed without either of them noticing the time. When the meeting finally ended, Alexander leaned back in his chair and looked toward the skyline for several thoughtful seconds. "I would like to offer you something different," he said. Naomi waited patiently. "I do not need another consultant. I already have excellent consultants. I need someone who will protect the purpose of this project every time it becomes easier to chase profits instead of people." Naomi hesitated before answering. "That is a responsibility, not a promotion." Alexander nodded. "Exactly." She accepted the position only after requesting one condition. Every renovated community center would include internships for local college students interested in architecture and engineering. Alexander agreed without negotiating a single detail. Over the following weeks, their professional relationship developed through countless planning sessions, construction visits, and strategy meetings across New York. They disagreed respectfully, challenged each other's assumptions, and gradually discovered that trust was built through consistency rather than grand promises. Employees throughout Whitmore Holdings began noticing something unusual. Their billionaire chief executive smiled more often during project reviews. Naomi, meanwhile, found herself laughing again without feeling guilty for doing so. One rainy evening, after touring a renovation site in Queens, Alexander drove her back to her apartment himself because the city had issued severe weather advisories. As they sat outside her building, watching raindrops race across the windshield, neither of them seemed eager to end the conversation. "Can I ask you something personal?" Alexander said quietly. Naomi looked toward him. "You may ask." He remained silent for a moment before speaking. "Who convinced you that carrying everything alone was the only way to be strong?" The question settled between them more heavily than the rain falling against the glass. Naomi did not answer immediately, because no one had ever asked her that before. And somewhere only a few miles away, Ethan Brooks finally reached for his phone, after months of waiting, believing it was time to call the woman he was certain had spent every day missing him, completely unaware that someone else had already begun seeing the quiet strength he had never taken the time to understand. Naomi Carter looked at the illuminated screen of her phone for several long seconds before answering the unfamiliar number. Something deep inside her already knew who was calling. Some voices left a memory that time could soften but never completely erase. "Naomi," Ethan Brooks said after she answered, his tone carrying the confidence of someone who believed familiarity still granted him access. "I have been thinking about you." Naomi stood beside the wide windows of her apartment, watching ferries move quietly across the East River beneath the evening lights. "I hope you have been well, Ethan," she replied with calm sincerity. There was no bitterness in her voice, and somehow that unsettled him more than anger ever could have. He smiled to himself, convinced her composure was only temporary. "I think we should meet. There are things we never finished talking about." Naomi remained silent for a moment before answering. "I believe we finished everything the day I left." Ethan laughed softly, almost dismissively. People say things like that when they are hurt. Time changes perspectives. Naomi glanced toward the notebook resting on her dining table, filled with construction schedules for 3 community centers that would break ground before winter. Her days had become so full of purpose that looking backward now felt strangely unfamiliar. "Time does change perspectives," she answered gently, "just not always in the direction people expect." Before Ethan could continue, she wished him well and ended the call with quiet respect. There was no dramatic confrontation, no attempt to prove she had moved on. She simply protected the peace she had worked so hard to rebuild. Across town, Ethan lowered his phone with growing confusion. That conversation had unfolded nothing like the countless versions he had imagined. She had not sounded lonely. She had not searched for excuses to continue talking. She had not even asked whether he was happy. For the first time, uncertainty slipped into a place where certainty had lived for months. The following afternoon, Naomi and Alexander Whitmore traveled together to Brooklyn to review the final design revisions for the first community center renovation. Children played basketball in the aging gymnasium, while neighborhood volunteers greeted Alexander by name, surprised that the billionaire continued visiting construction sites personally instead of relying on reports prepared by executives. Naomi watched as he spent nearly 20 minutes listening to an elderly volunteer explain why preserving a faded mural painted 30 years earlier mattered more than replacing it with something modern. Alexander never interrupted. When the conversation ended, he quietly instructed his project manager to restore the mural instead of covering it. "History deserves respect," he said simply. During the drive back to Manhattan, Naomi looked out the passenger window before speaking. "Most people with your responsibilities would have delegated today." Alexander kept his attention on the road. "Buildings are easy to finance," he replied. "Trust is not. If people believe we genuinely care, they will protect these places long after construction crews leave." Naomi smiled, recognizing that his leadership was built on patience rather than image. As the city skyline appeared ahead of them, Alexander finally asked the question he had postponed for weeks. "Would you have dinner with me this Saturday?" He paused before adding one thoughtful sentence. "Not to discuss work, not because I expect an answer today, simply because I enjoy the person you are becoming whenever you forget to carry yesterday with you." Naomi lowered her eyes as a quiet warmth settled over her heart, unfamiliar yet comforting. Before she could answer, Alexander's assistant called through the vehicle speaker with unexpected news. A major charity gala scheduled for the following month had officially announced Whitmore Holdings as its headline sponsor, and among the invited business leaders listed for the evening was Ethan Brooks, a detail that neither Naomi nor Alexander had expected to hear. Saturday arrived wrapped in the cool breeze of late October, carrying the unmistakable feeling that New York was quietly preparing for another season. Golden leaves drifted across the sidewalks of Central Park, while the afternoon sun painted the skyline with a gentle warmth that softened even the tallest buildings. Naomi Carter stood before the mirror in her apartment for several thoughtful moments, adjusting the sleeve of a deep emerald dress she had almost decided not to wear. It was elegant without demanding attention, the kind of dress chosen for comfort rather than admiration. She reminded herself that this evening was simply dinner, nothing more. When Alexander Whitmore arrived precisely at 6 o'clock, he greeted her with the same calm smile that had become increasingly familiar over the past several weeks. His charcoal overcoat carried droplets from a brief autumn shower, and instead of flowers or expensive gifts, he held a small paper bag from an independent bookstore near Bryant Park. "I remembered you mentioning your father's favorite architect," he said as he handed it to her. Inside rested a first-edition biography she had searched for years without success. Naomi looked at the worn cover with genuine surprise. "How did you find this?" Alexander smiled modestly. "A retired bookstore owner owed me a favor. I thought someone else should benefit from it." Throughout dinner, overlooking the Hudson River, conversation flowed effortlessly between memories of childhood, favorite books, and the quiet satisfaction of creating places where strangers could eventually feel at home. For the first time since her marriage had ended, Naomi caught herself laughing without hesitation, and when she realized it, she did not immediately apologize to herself for feeling happy. Alexander noticed the change, but wisely chose not to mention it. Some moments became stronger when they were simply allowed to exist. Meanwhile, across Manhattan, Ethan Brooks sat alone inside his office long after his employees had gone home. His desk remained covered with contracts waiting for signatures, but his attention never settled on a single page. Instead, he found himself opening Naomi's social media profile for the first time in months. There were very few photographs. She had never been someone who measured happiness through public attention. Still, one recently published image immediately caught his eye. Naomi stood beside Alexander and several neighborhood volunteers at the entrance of the newly restored Brooklyn Community Center. No luxury, no glamorous headlines, just genuine smiles shared with families whose lives had already begun changing because the building had reopened. Ethan studied the photograph longer than he intended. Alexander was not standing in front of Naomi or placing himself at the center of the picture. He stood slightly behind her, applauding while she spoke with local children. It was a small detail, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore once noticed. Ethan suddenly remembered dozens of business dinners where Naomi had quietly celebrated his accomplishments while no one had ever asked about hers. That memory settled heavily inside him. The following Monday morning, financial newspapers across the country featured Whitmore Holdings on their front pages after the company's nationwide community initiative received a prestigious humanitarian award. One photograph accompanied every article. Alexander accepted the recognition on stage, but instead of delivering the keynote speech himself, he invited Naomi to explain why rebuilding neighborhoods mattered. Watching the broadcast from his office television, Ethan felt something unfamiliar tightening inside his chest. It was not jealousy of Alexander's success. It was the painful realization that another man had recognized Naomi's voice long before he had ever bothered to hear it himself. Late that afternoon, an elegant cream envelope arrived at Naomi's office, bearing the seal of the upcoming charity gala. Inside were two invitations addressed personally to Mr. Alexander Whitmore and Miss Naomi Carter, confirming that they would be seated together at the head table. Neither of them realized that the seating arrangement had already placed 3 lives on a collision course that would quietly change all of them before the evening came to an end. The ballroom of the Grand Lexington Hotel shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers that reflected thousands of tiny lights across polished marble and towering columns wrapped in white orchids. Every major newspaper in New York had sent photographers. Business leaders, philanthropists, university presidents, and elected officials filled the room with conversations that blended into a gentle hum of ambition and celebration. The annual charity gala had always been one of the city's most influential evenings, but this year, all attention centered on Whitmore Holdings and its nationwide commitment to rebuilding underserved communities. Alexander Whitmore stepped from the arriving limousine first before turning back toward Naomi Carter with the same quiet courtesy he had shown since the day they met. He extended his hand, never assuming she needed it, simply offering it. Naomi accepted with a grateful smile as she stepped onto the red carpet wearing a deep crimson gown that reflected confidence rather than extravagance. It was not the dress itself that drew attention, it was the woman wearing it. She walked with the calm assurance of someone who no longer needed the approval of strangers to recognize her own worth. Camera flashes illuminated the entrance as reporters called Alexander's name, but several quickly shifted their attention after recognizing Naomi from recent national coverage of the Community Restoration Initiative. "Miss Carter, how many more neighborhoods will the project reach next year?" one journalist asked. Naomi answered with the same sincerity that had defined every public appearance she had made. "As many as we responsibly can. Buildings matter because people matter." Standing beside her, Alexander quietly smiled without interrupting. Inside the ballroom, Ethan Brooks had been speaking with several investors when the conversations around him unexpectedly faded into silence. Curious, he turned toward the entrance. Time seemed to slow as he watched Naomi walk into the room beside Alexander. She was not trying to prove anything. She was not searching the crowd for familiar faces. She was simply living a life that no longer revolved around someone else's opinion. Ethan realized with painful clarity that the woman standing before him looked remarkably similar to the one he had once married, yet somehow completely different. The difference was not wealth. It was peace. Throughout dinner, Alexander introduced Naomi not as an employee or consultant, but as the visionary responsible for shaping the company's most meaningful initiative. Every introduction carried genuine admiration rather than obligation. Several nonprofit directors requested future meetings with her, and university deans asked whether she would consider mentoring architecture students. Even seasoned executives sought her perspective on community development. Ethan watched each conversation unfold from across the ballroom, noticing something he had never appreciated during their marriage. Naomi had always possessed this intelligence, this grace, this quiet ability to make every person feel heard. He had simply become too distracted by his own ambitions to notice. Later in the evening, the Master of Ceremonies invited Alexander to the stage to receive the Foundation's highest humanitarian recognition. As applause filled the ballroom, Alexander accepted the Crystal Award before pausing at the podium. "Recognition belongs to those willing to see possibilities where others only calculate limitations," he said. Then, without hesitation, he turned toward Naomi. "The person who deserves to stand beside me tonight is Miss Naomi Carter." She reminded all of us that the greatest investment any company can make is in people. The audience rose together in a standing ovation as Naomi slowly joined him beneath the warm stage lights. Ethan remained standing with everyone else, applauding almost automatically, but inside he felt the quiet weight of a truth that could no longer be denied. He had spent months believing she needed someone powerful to rescue her. Instead, another man had simply recognized the strength she already possessed. As the applause gradually faded, Alexander looked at Naomi with unmistakable sincerity and asked, quietly enough that only she could hear, "When this evening is over, may I finally stop pretending that my feelings are only professional?" Naomi met his eyes, her answer already beginning to form, unaware that Ethan had started walking across the ballroom toward them, carrying words he should have spoken long before either of them arrived at this unforgettable night. The applause had barely settled when Ethan Brooks reached the edge of the stage, stopping several respectful feet away from Naomi Carter and Alexander Whitmore. For a brief moment, the ballroom seemed to grow quieter, not because anyone expected a confrontation, but because every person present sensed they were witnessing the closing chapter of a story whose beginning they had never fully known. Ethan looked at Naomi with an honesty that had arrived months too late. "May I have just 1 minute?" he asked gently. Naomi glanced at Alexander. He gave a small nod before taking a single step back, offering her the space to make her own decision. It was another quiet gesture, and once again it reminded Ethan of how differently another man had chosen to love the woman he had taken for granted. Naomi agreed with a simple nod, and the three of them walked toward a quieter terrace, overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Beyond the glass, the city shimmered beneath countless lights, each one reminding her how many lives continued moving forward, regardless of yesterday's regrets. Ethan folded his hands together before speaking. "I have replayed the day you left more times than I can count," he admitted. "For months I convinced myself you would come back because I believed I was the best part of your future. I never stopped to consider that you had already been the best part of mine." Naomi listened without interruption. There was no satisfaction in seeing his regret. Time had transformed old pain into quiet understanding. Ethan continued, his voice steady but humbled. "I thought success meant finding someone who fit the life I wanted. I never realized success meant becoming the kind of person worthy of the life I already had." The words lingered in the cool evening air. Naomi smiled softly, not because they erased the past, but because they acknowledged it with honesty. "Thank you for saying that," she replied. "There was a time when I needed to hear those words. Today, I simply appreciate them." Ethan lowered his eyes, understanding the difference immediately. Some apologies repaired relationships. Others simply helped people become better versions of themselves. He reached into his jacket pocket and carefully placed a small velvet box on the terrace table. Inside rested the wedding ring Naomi had left behind months earlier. "I kept hoping there would be a reason to return this," he said quietly. Naomi looked at the ring for a long moment before gently closing the box and sliding it back toward him. "It belongs to a chapter that taught us both something valuable," she answered. "But it does not belong to my future." Ethan nodded slowly. There was no argument left to make, no promise capable of changing what time had already rewritten. He extended his hand toward Alexander instead. "Take good care of her." Alexander accepted the handshake with quiet respect. "I will never assume she needs someone to complete her," he replied. "I will simply spend every day appreciating that she chose to share her life with me." Ethan smiled for the first time that evening, a smile touched by sadness, but also by acceptance. Without another word, he turned and walked back through the ballroom, disappearing into the crowd as quietly as he had once disappeared from Naomi's life. Several weeks later, beneath a bright spring sky, family and close friends gathered inside a historic garden overlooking the Hudson River. There were no television cameras, no business headlines, and no public spectacle. Alexander and Naomi exchanged simple vows that spoke of partnership, respect, and choosing each other freely every single day. As they walked together beneath blooming cherry trees after the ceremony, Naomi slipped her hand into Alexander's and smiled toward the future waiting ahead. She had once believed losing a marriage meant losing her direction. Instead, she discovered that the greatest victories were never about proving someone wrong. They were about becoming someone so deeply at peace that the past could no longer decide the shape of tomorrow.